Hello everyone, welcome to issue 13 of Koi Talk podcast with myself, Chris Wall and Ricky Stoddart. How are you, sir?
I'm good, how are you?
Amazing.
Good. Hope everyone else out there as well.
Yeah, out in Koi world. What's new?
Not a lot really.
Right.
We'll wrap it up there.
Yeah, thanks very much for listening. I'll see you soon. So it's...
You're the man who asked the questions.
I know, I just thought
sit
that.
here
Yeah,
waffling.
I just thought it would... I'd do a role reversal, but it didn't work very well. So
No.
This week, it's a subject that we're going to talk about, which is probably... I don't know if there's too much knowledge about it in the mainstream of the hobby. Something that obviously we've been quite aware of for some time, and it's been a technique that's been used in Japan for quite some time. And that is basically growing your koi, mud ponds versus concrete pond growing.
Nice one. Yeah.
Pros, cons. Is the day of the mud pond? Is there a point in the future where they become slightly obsolete? Are they just entrenched in the Japanese culture of growing koi? So many questions, Ricky.
There's no way mud ponds are ever becoming obsolete.
I kind of knew that, but yeah.
I mean, they're just too big of a part of the whole process in Japan.
In terms of results, if we're getting into the nitty-gritty of it.
Yeah, not necessarily in results, no, but I mean, let's face it, it's hard to compete with one fish having 20,000-30,000 gallons of water for summer to swim around in. That's pretty hard to replicate. Certain elements of them are hard to replicate, although I think if we're talking your question outright results, can it be done indoors? Yes, it absolutely can. I think the probably biggest part of this really comes down more to techniques than the actual environment. It's just you need different techniques depending on the environment as well. So in a mud pond, you're working blind. This is the biggest thing. There's so much to getting results out of mud ponds that people probably underestimate. You know, the first summer, I think it was 2016. That's a lie. 2006. I was 16 at the time. So went out to Japan for the summer work experience and spent a lot of time with the guys at NND, and my God, it was a real eye-opener what actually went on, because my belief at the time was that these mud ponds were these mystical things up in the mountains that breeders went and put the fish in and then went every so often, chucked them a bit of food, and by autumn pulled these fish out, and these results were just
easy.
mind-blowing. And I think there was a couple of videos around at the time that sort of portrayed that as being the case. And I mean, there's something special about the whole mud pond thing, because even at that point, those videos, I can't remember what they were called now, it was a 3-part Nishikigoi trilogy, I think it was.
Yeah.
I mean, they got me big time. I was hooked. It was the one thing I wanted to be, doing them harvests and seeing them fish being raised and that whole process. And the actual reality of learning about it was crazy. I mean, you just think of certain things, getting around the ponds even for a start logistically is phenomenal, because they're not just in one place. The spread between them, and the guys are checking them daily. It's not just being left. There's some breeders, admittedly, they can't get to them daily because the ponds are so remote. It'd just be impossible. They either have friends nearby who go and check, or they just get visited every so often. I mean, you can get feeders in Japan that can fit several people inside. Hirasawa tends to own quite a lot of them.
I was going to say the famous story of
crazy.
The vans driving around and all they do is top up feeders.
Oh man, and it's that was the sort of first thing, and so as we're going around, just simple things, the daily observation, the amount of work involved in getting around, checking, and then I think the biggest variable factor in all this is that the climate dictates everything that happens, and the end results are massively dictated by climate. In dry summers, water levels are lower in the ponds. All that lower volume means less food can go in the pond, and there's probably less fresh water available to actually keep filling the pond up and topping it up. Therefore, because of the lack of that, feeding levels have to be reduced, which will naturally affect the output, because although there's a lot of natural food source in a mud pond, it's not the bit that pushes the maximum growth. That's like it's the cherry on top.
Yeah.
All that stuff. It's the power food, the treats that probably add that extra bulk. But, you know, really, yeah, like I say, a bad drought. And likewise, if it's too much rain, you know, we're talking mudslides. Literally, I've seen, with fry ponds, one pond fall into another. Brutal. But then, too much of it. I mean, never forget with the fry ponds. I mean, my God, we was working away. It was August, so I mean, it was absolutely red hot, unbearable. And the bit of rain had been forecast, and we downed everything. Back to the fish house, getting crushed oyster shell.
Yeah.
That's it.
It's a buffer.
Out to the fry ponds, just scattering it around to prevent against a massive pH crash from the monsoon that was sort of heading that way. And you've always sort of thought, you know, what if the fish get sick? Well, admittedly, they need to go into the pond healthy, which is important. There's more chance of fish naturally recovering because generally the pressure on their immune system is a lot less, because the pathogen pressure and everything due to the water volume is a lot lower. But there was one pond we was watching, Takia Mud Pond Complex, and it has some Nisai in, and we were watching these fish. There was a log that was sort of in the corner of the pond, and they were flashing on it like crazy. And we'd noticed the feeding, you know, wasn't quite on point. And sure enough, blew my mind. We were opening a pack of a very, very potent chemical called Mazaton. And
I remember it.
Before we know it, we're dosing the pond with Mazaton. And I'm thinking, holy shit, you can actually treat a mud pond. You know, the thought of doing it with something like malachite and formalin, no-go. I mean, Jesus Christ, you need a remortgage. But that stuff, I mean, nasty potent chemical, but it was needed. And you're just fighting these battles all the time. You know, some ponds, you know, they do rely on getting, let's say, a bit of fresh water to them as well, stop them getting really stagnant. All the small attentions to detail in getting the results, and this is where I mentioned technique as opposed to going mud pond or concrete. One pond we got to, I was with Fujo. It was really quite a remote place, and a frog must have just spawned quite recently, and there was just mass amounts of tadpoles around the edge of the pond. We was back to the truck to find a bucket, and we then
get them out.
We were getting all the tadpoles out, and obviously to prevent them getting in there, taking oxygen, taking the natural food source away, all the rest of it. That's the small bits that you really see compound and make a big difference to the end result. Plantation in the pond then as well, you know, from blanket weeds. I forget one of the jobs, we're talking 40 degrees. I'm absolutely dying in my pair of waders.
Raking it out, yeah.
I am being sent to walk around this half-acre mud pond with a net, scooping blanket weed off the edge before it's then medicated. Obviously, if left, we all know what blanket weed can do. It's absorbing nutrients. At some point of the day, it's stripping oxygen as well. It's not what you want in a pond. Then you've got, you know, the same Takia Mud Pond Complex, another breeder used to share that, or not mention. I mean, this was quite a seriously high-level breeder. The ponds on there were so poorly maintained. I could see the water was stagnant, duckweed floating on top, and just, you know, mass covering there. Again, everything that's going to be having an adverse effect on that pond and the quality. So, not just necessarily, you know, mud pond, concrete pond. Either of those with the wrong knowledge and wrong use of them is not going to gain good results.
I think the concept of different levels of performance for individual mud ponds as well.
Oh yeah, that's
crazy. Obviously, where you were saying certain breeders will have ponds dotted around.
I'm gonna have to butt in. You just reminded me of no, because this ties in. Obviously, on the last episode, I was talking about nitrate.
Yeah.
So you just prompted me there. This was another big thing. Certain areas in Japan become known for certain varieties because of the mud ponds and how they actually perform. So the breeders tend to believe that the more stony-based ponds are better for Showa, better for the Sumi, whereas the heavier clays, you know, any variety, but that you tend to find a lot. Uenuma is a great prefecture where there's a lot of Showa breeders, and all the mud ponds are very, very rocky at the bottom. Just a belief they've got that those ponds perform better for Sumi. Kohaku breeders, on the other hand, want the water green. Watercolour was one we worked on massively, and again, it was it's almost obviously indicating health of the pond and what's going on, but it's also an indicator that helps with feeding, which I'll get to. But the watercolour, so it was almost like a turquoisey, bluey green colour, which was like the optimum. So seen quite a few ponds with them guys with it, and when you see it, it's like, yeah, that looks the business. That looks like a healthy environment. These shower-based ponds, more rocky, water tends to be a little bit lighter, a little bit clearer, probably in a lot of instances as well. But then, so I spent some of that trip with Nogami, obviously elite Kohaku breeder, and I never ever forget loading up these sacks onto the back of the truck, and all I could see over it was plants and vegetables on the packet, and a load of Japanese writing. And I'm like, what are we doing here? So yeah, bearing in mind our conversation on the last one, say around nitrate and stuff, we and Sue to drive up to these ponds. I mean, incredibly well maintained up in this particular area, Mukaichi Machi in Nagaoka, where Nagami's ponds are. There's him and Dainichi share the area roughly around these ponds. Incredibly well maintained, looked after, great watercolour. But this particular pond we were going to wasn't green enough. We was wanting, obviously, Kohaku, Beni. We was wanting to make that Beni pop, so we wanted to culture spirulina. How did we do that? We slit some of these sacks open and went tipping fertiliser straight into the pond.
Full of nitrate and phosphate?
Yes, to make it nice and green. Because that's what they wanted to achieve, what he wanted to do with that Beni. Still to this day, I think I've got a picture of it if I dug through, but I was just like, wow, what else is in plant fertiliser? But it did the job. And Nagami ponds were that heavier green colour.
Well, he certainly produces a few rather nice Kohaku, doesn't he?
Benny's off the chain. When you see him at harvest time, it's something else. But that was one of them moments for me. I'm like, these ponds are really not. There's not a lot natural about them. These are really heavily maintained by man in order to get the results. I would say the ponds that are just left to nature are going to deem and yield pretty shitty results out of them, in all honesty.
So if we move towards the concrete raising of fish,
I'm not quite done with mud ponds yet. You've got me reminiscing here, Chris. This is serious stuff. I mean, I was talking about watercolour again. How we're gauging feeding, because this is going to be important in this whole topic. When a pond is indoors and crystal clear, it's so much easier to gauge the feeding because we can physically see what's going off. You can see exactly how the body's looking. Are they too fat? Are they looking a bit too thin? It's a lot easier to gauge what's going on. And you sort of test the water. You can control the water a lot more indoors than what you can in a mud pond. So how do you gauge feeding in a mud pond? It's really not. This is what I was thinking.
Until they come out,
keep chucking it in. Again, attention to detail here, and this is just demonstrating technique over sort of environment to the biggest degree. So yes, there's natural food. We don't know to what extent these fish are eating all day long on very high protein, very high fat, things like snails, worms, or the other inhabitants you'll get in a mud pond. So there's a big element of manual feeding as well, sinking, floating pellets, whatever it is. Most of these ponds have got automatic feeders on and are being fed constantly throughout the day, every 2 or 3 hours. So yeah, how do you know? So the first thing was a very just visual check, and I'll never forget Makoto, Marusho Koi Farm part of NND, making a joke that he used to go to the same spot, same time, every day, same clothes, same this, same that, and it just went on and on as a joke at that point. But that was about observing a small manual feed once a day. So they go, and so the fish knew, because we know how sensitive they are to understanding their environment. So they knew what was. He could feed some food manually and assess the feeding behaviour from that, based on the fish knowing, that pattern. Then patterns really do get nailed down, because I was literally on one of the mud pond complexes manually feeding a pond full of chagoi, where I think it was a crazy amount. We're just filling these buckets of food up and chucking them in. The pond literally behind me on the small track, just about wide enough for the truck, was about 3 meters deep, And at the time pulling up, couldn't see a single thing in there. As I turn around from feeding those fish, all of a sudden there's all these 3 and 4 year old fish circling around the feeding ring. Within 2 minutes of that, the feeder went off. That was just remarkable to see. It was everything I needed to see at that point to know how finely tuned those fish get to learn the feeding cycle. And from having that feeding cycle, how we can then use that to fine tune it and improve things and keep it on point. So this manual feed done once a day, time to observe, breeder goes with as much sort of reliability as he can in timings and stuff, and just gauges there how the fish react to a bit of a manual feed. It's not actually a proper feed, it's just a test. So do they come buzzing in the ring? Are they not interested? Blah, blah, blah. That's that. Then we've got the other big visual check, which was, again, at the time, it made such simple common sense when I was told, but at that point I didn't know how muddy the water looks. I possibly, listening to this thinking it's a fucking mud pond, it's going to look muddy. No, it looks very different. When I spoke about those watercolours, a pond looks very different when the carp are actually rummaging in the bottom a lot because they're hungry. If they're hungry, they'll rummage more looking for food. But what that creates is like these plumes of mud that come up from the bottom. So you can see there seems to be more turbidity and sediment in the water at that point. So we know, fish are hungry, right? We need to increase the manual feeds to try and counteract that and calm the water down. At that point, we consider, we're possibly getting there. So, all done, again, experience coming into it. But you can see it's really technique there over environment. Environment is just one small part of that process. The big plus to the environment, as I see with a mud pond, is the vast expanse. So obviously that water, if maintained properly, we're talking one fish in tens of thousands of gallons, depending on where it's at. They're always quite lightly stocked. The swimming area is what I see for that. I think it's underestimated when fish have the ability to swim, what that does for the body. When they can swim,
the structure of the fish.
And swimming length, I'm not talking swimming down, I'm talking swimming lengths. It makes sense. If they're doing that all day long over big lengths, they're going to build muscle up. They're not getting fatty, flabby, they're building muscle. You couple that with the right feeding and the right diet, the fact they're hitting these, super high protein, high fat treats as well, and being able to work it off and build it properly, it's a massive part of developing that seriously monstrous bone structure that you see on these jumbo fish that get raised in mud ponds, I do believe.
So it can't be ignored, the fact that concrete raising, indoor raising of fish can mitigate quite a lot of risks, for example, that a mud pond
Huge
would
amounts.
produce.
Huge amounts.
I guess from a commercial perspective, the nature of having filtration and power means stocking density is higher.
Yes.
You can monitor fish health, and I guess ultimately from a fiscal aspect, fish are viewable. I know if fish are heavy on food, you're not going to start chasing them around, but clients can inquire about fish that would otherwise be in a mud pond from sort of May until October. What I'm getting at is it a modern way of raising koi? Do you think it's going to become something that's not more accepted but more prominent?
I think there's the different angles. It is a lot more expensive raising indoors. My whole business is sort of built off the back of doing this. We can match the results. You've seen that, size-wise, and this is something I've obsessed about for a long time, and I keep refining and working towards. Because for me, raising koi is all great. You can get the length very easily indoors. It's when it comes to getting the volume. This is where I think the game changes, because in order to get the volume, you need vast amounts of food. When you've got vast amounts of food, you then got to build your system around processing those vast amounts. And in order to make it cost-effective to do, you've got to stock, especially if you've having to heat the water through winter, for example, you've got to then stock the pond heavy enough to make it cost effective. So it's balancing all these things up. If people have seen the stocking levels I'm keeping, it probably would be better to keep 50 of those Heeltsaurus in a pond as opposed to the 110 that's in there. But at that point, I'm doubling my cost per fish. and it's not a cheap game to do it. So that's the realities of it. It's far more control. They can deliver the results as well, but there's a lot more costs to
involved.
Yeah, and we are seeing it more and more. The breeders, investing in the ponds properly as well. I mean, to do it again, for me, you're looking optimal setups. I want surface area, and not just surface area. I want lengths. You're seeing this more and more. If you notice, my main growing ponds are rectangular, so they're a lot longer than they are wide. And that, for me, I believe is part of the success in the raising in there, because they've got a good length to keep swimming. And that helps build that body similar to that of the mud pond. And if we actually look, Sakai's probably been the most pivotal in rooting this. It's the long, thin ponds. They're like raceways, just long ponds they're using to raise the fish indoors more, which I do believe is a big part in gaining the volume. And not everybody has got the expanse to have a 20-foot long, 30-foot, 40-foot long pond in the garden. So that's sort of where, to emulate that outside of Japan is not easy. Depth don't really come into this for me. I don't believe depth's important in the slightest. In fact, probably more shallower than anything on that regard. It's that having that length and that surface area to go at, I consider to be vital. And yeah, I mean, if you want the serious ponds, Momotaro, that absolute beast of an indoor pond that they built, it's an absolute spectacle. But again, it's a very expensive pond to run. So you've got to factor all that in. But yes, you can achieve the results indoors as well. And with control, breeders, top people, Ryuki Narita, for example, all the best fish are raised indoors. But he's got big systems there, tens of thousands of gallons that are lightly stocked as well. In comparison, big, vast filtration systems on them. It's the best conditions, but that's a pond that's very, very expensive to set up, very expensive to keep running as well. So, yeah, that's why you'll always see in koi raising in Japan, mud ponds will always have a place, because for breeders, obviously, they're very low running cost ponds, and there's not even any electricity to them, is there? No water bills, nothing. It's a big part of it. And if it was all pushed indoors, you'd see a vast rise in prices, which nobody wants to see. But from a results-wise, yeah, absolutely. I think there's some elements can be hard to replicate indoors. Again, I've said the feeding side is difficult, because if you consider just alone the manual feeding, and how the quantity of that you push through a system and processing all that waste is not easy. But then you also consider that in the mud pond they're grazing on all this other food. So if you took that and started throwing that on top of the pelletized food you're putting into a concrete based system, handling the pollution is just going to be insane. Very, very difficult to do. So I think that's really the biggest, if you sort of pros and cons, the results are doable. It's just how you do actually go about it. You've got a big mud pond, you're probably going to be able to do it with more fish and be more cost effective, but you can still get them results with a concrete pond if you know what you're doing.
I think the sort of subject came about when I remember last year I had a customer, I think, was it fish, I think it was from Taniguchi, raised inside. And it was sort of, he was taken aback a bit. I think the mystique and the concept of, well, why is it not outside in a mud pond? Surely it can't. Obviously, you and I know the fish came back and it was an absolute worldie. But it's just interesting perceptions that people, perhaps it's a side of the industry that people aren't so familiar with. Naturally, people think the fish are all grown in mud ponds. Yeah. But obviously in Niigata,
it's growing more and more down the southern breeders, so to speak, who are some pretty big hitters. Yeah. I'd say Sakai, Taniguchi, Omasako. Omasako not so much, but you just are seeing, Narita raises all of his best fish indoors. Yes, he's got mud ponds. Is he going to put his best All Japan Show contenders out there? I don't think so.
Is that purely from being risk adverse?
Completely.
So do you think in their heart of hearts they could get better results outside, or is it just a case of weighing up.
I think you've pointed a good
Risk versus
part.
reward.
Part of those fish I'm talking about there is he's trying to raise those fish to actually get them finished. In order to get them finished, you need control.
Yeah.
Not only that, you need UV.
Mm.
You need daylight, and obviously mud ponds with the level of turbidity in the water, there's always an element of colour softening in a mud pond because there's a lot of it's just dark, and it's not the environment for finishing a koi properly. You can do it in them. Some breeders do. Nogami's a prime example that for years I've watched him literally start conditioning fish and the end part of the mud pond growing season and timing harvest to a point where he gets that fish looking at absolute
Prime.
peak body, everything, harvests it. It spends a couple of days in a concrete pond where the sort of reaction to the fresh water pushes everything up and makes it even more intense. You just get the edge on the Shiroji into a show, goes off, wins its Grand Champion award, and then the sort of shit hits the fan a little bit. You have to start conditioning it, bringing it back after that, but then it goes for its indoor period. But even Nogami now has invested with the latest fish house he built, has got a very big finishing pond at the back of it, where he's invested heavier in filtration. Got to remember, a lot of the farmer type breeders will say this, are not used to raising fish. This is where in Japan we think they are all the masters at raising and doing. They're actually, it's few and far between how many actually have really good skills at raising fish in concrete ponds. I think in the Western world we're actually far better at it in general than most Japanese breeders are, because it's not their bag. Typically the indoor ponds is somewhere they bring the fish
Sales area
to sell them and keep them over winter out of the snow, and then get them back out to the mud pond the following year. Actually keeping them indoors and raising them indoors would, I think they'd struggle. There's some of them that are springing to mind right now, I'll not mention them, but there's just no way they would do it. So, it's doable. I think it's a subject we can definitely expand on more at some point, but I think the general consensus is yes, it's results are doable in either. Technique's more important than the environment is where I would end on that one.
Interesting subject, and hopefully one that not too many people have heard too much information about. So good to chat about it, Rick, and as always, stay tuned for next episodes, and take care, and we'll see you soon.